Johnny Carson revealed the 9 Golden Age guests he loved the most. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson invited America to end the day with him. As host of The Tonight Show from 1962 to 1992, he interviewed more than 22,000 guests, everyone from Hollywood legends to rising talents hoping for their big break. To viewers at home, it all looked effortless. Carson smiled, delivered his trademark quips, and kept the conversations flowing. But behind the scenes, Johnny was one of television's most guarded personalities. He was polite, always professional, but rarely let anyone see the man behind the desk. That's what makes this list so fascinating, because buried within those thousands of interviews was a much shorter, private list, a handful of rare guests who managed to break through Carson's protective shell. These weren't just good bookings. They were people who brought out sides of Johnny his audience hardly ever saw. The emotional Carson, the playful Carson, the curious intellectual, and the nostalgic student of comedy. According to producers, Carson could be brutally strict about timing and structure. Segments ran on a tight clock, commercials had to hit their marks, and very few guests were ever given an extra minute. Yet with these select few, Johnny would break his own rules, extending conversations, delaying commercials, and sometimes even waving off producers entirely. So, who were these 9 Golden Age stars that Johnny Carson valued above all the others? And what made them different from the thousands who came and went? Let's dive into the list, beginning with the man whose heartfelt words actually brought Carson to tears on national television. Jimmy Stewart, the guest who made Carson cry. When Jimmy Stewart appeared on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson reacted differently than he did with most guests. Normally guarded and perfectly in control, Carson became almost reverent in Stewart's presence. To him, Stewart represented something rare in Hollywood, genuine humility. Unlike many aging stars who arrived armed with polished stories, Stewart stumbled over words, paused to think, and occasionally rambled. Yet Carson found that honesty refreshing. Johnny respected that Jimmy never tried to be slick, a producer later recalled. He was simply himself. The moment that sealed Stewart's place at the top of Carson's list came in 1981. Stewart read a poem about his golden retriever, Bo, who had passed away. The verses were plain and heartfelt, but their sincerity broke through Carson's famously tough shell. To the shock of viewers and crew alike, Johnny teared up on national television. A longtime staff member remembered, he didn't make a joke to cover it. He didn't deflect. He just let the moment happen. That willingness to be vulnerable was almost unheard of for Carson, and it revealed how much Stewart meant to him. Producers later admitted Carson even bent his rigid rules for Stewart, extending segments and moving commercials so the actor could have more time. And on the eve of his final show in 1992, Stewart was among the select few Carson personally called to thank. For Johnny, Jimmy Stewart wasn't just a guest. He was proof that television could still create moments of honesty in an industry built on illusion. Bob Newhart, the comic who made it look effortless. If Jimmy Stewart touched Carson's heart, Bob Newhart connected with his comedic mind. Known for his deadpan delivery and subtle timing, Newhart shared Johnny's love for understated humor. Carson once described him as the most effortlessly funny man I know. And coming from Johnny, there was no higher compliment. What set Newhart apart from the endless parade of comedians was his conversational style. Instead of recycling material from his act, he treated Carson like a partner in dialogue. Their exchanges had the rhythm of 2 jazz musicians riffing together, Johnny setting up a line, Bob undercutting it with a perfectly timed pause or understated punchline. Carson valued that chemistry so much he often bent his own rules. Normally strict about timing, he would let Newhart's segments run long, even signaling the control room to delay commercials. With most guests, Johnny was counting down the seconds, a producer later admitted. With Bob, he never wanted it to end. Off camera, Newhart earned Johnny's respect in ways few stars managed. He arrived without entourages, remembered crew members by name, and treated everyone, from pages to producers, with genuine kindness. That humility mattered to Carson, who despised Hollywood egos. Their relationship eventually moved beyond the studio. Newhart was one of the very few celebrities Carson invited into his private world, joining him for rounds of golf away from the cameras. For Johnny, who fiercely guarded his personal life, that kind of friendship spoke louder than any on-air compliment. Bob Newhart wasn't just a guest who made Johnny laugh. He was a peer who reminded Carson why comedy, at its best, looked so effortless. Burt Reynolds, the perfect partner in mischief. When Burt Reynolds showed up on The Tonight Show, viewers knew they were in for more than a routine interview. Reynolds treated his appearances less like promotions and more like playful competitions with Johnny Carson. The two men delighted in trying to outdo each other, and Carson loved every second of it. Unlike most stars, who arrived armed with publicist-approved talking points, Burt came prepared for fun. Sometimes that meant sneaking water pistols onto the set. Other times it meant ambushing Carson with shaving cream mid-conversation. Rather than being annoyed, Johnny reveled in the chaos. Off camera, he reportedly laughed harder at Reynolds' antics than he did on air. Carson admired that Reynolds could both take a joke and return one. Johnny had a private test for whether he truly liked a guest. Could he tease them without offense? Many celebrities failed. Burt passed with flying colors. He laughed at Johnny's digs about failed movies or his high-profile romances, often egging Johnny on for more. Producers noted that Carson even used Reynolds as an example for nervous newcomers, telling them, "Just relax and have fun with it, like Burt does." That was the highest praise Johnny could offer. What made their banter special was the authenticity behind it. Beneath the pranks and jokes was genuine camaraderie. Reynolds wasn't just a movie star trying to plug his latest role. He was a friend who understood television as well as Johnny did. For Carson, Burt Reynolds was the rare guest who turned talk show formality into pure, unpredictable fun. Orson Welles, the genius who fascinated Carson. For most of America, Johnny Carson was the master of light entertainment, quick jokes, smooth interviews, and easy charm. But those who worked with him knew he had a deeply intellectual side, one that rarely surfaced on television. It took Orson Welles to bring it out. Welles, the legendary filmmaker behind Citizen Kane, fascinated Carson not as a celebrity, but as a thinker. When Orson was scheduled to appear, Johnny did something he almost never did for other guests. He prepared. He brushed up on history, literature, and theater so their conversations could stretch beyond Hollywood gossip. On air, the difference was obvious. Their talks wandered into politics, art, and magic, subjects Johnny rarely touched with anyone else. One night, Welles performed elaborate illusions that left Carson beaming like a child at a carnival. That was real magic, not TV magic, he told the audience, unable to hide his awe. What impressed Johnny most wasn't Welles's reputation, but his candor. Orson spoke as openly about his failures as he did about his triumphs, admitting to firings and flops without the Hollywood spin. Carson respected that honesty enormously. A close friend later revealed that Johnny considered those conversations with Welles some of the most satisfying moments of his career. "For a few minutes, I get to be myself rather than Johnny Carson," he reportedly said. For Carson, Orson Welles wasn't just another guest. He was the rare intellect who allowed Johnny to reveal the curiosity he usually kept hidden. Jack Benny, the master who inspired Carson. When Jack Benny appeared on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson's demeanor shifted. The usually confident host, always in command of his stage, became more like an eager student sitting before his teacher. Carson often admitted that Benny was the reason he pursued comedy. Watching him on radio and early television had been, as Johnny put it, my masterclass in timing. Benny's influence was obvious. Carson's signature style, the well-timed pause, the subtle glance, the ability to let silence get a bigger laugh than a punchline, all traced back to Jack Benny. A writer from The Tonight Show once explained, "Johnny's entire philosophy came from Jack. You didn't have to dominate a scene, you could make the other person funny by how you reacted." On camera, Carson's respect showed in small but telling ways. He laughed more freely, listened more intently, and even adjusted the setup of interviews to favor Benny's camera angles. Producers recalled him saying, "Make sure you get Jack's reactions, not mine." A remarkable gesture for a man who usually demanded tight control over every detail. The generational link made their appearances even more meaningful. Benny had pioneered radio comedy decades earlier, and by the 1970s, he was passing that torch directly to Carson, the reigning king of late night. Off-stage, Johnny kept a framed photo of Benny in his office, the only celebrity picture he displayed. For Carson, Jack Benny wasn't just a guest. He was the man who shaped his craft and the comedy blueprint he carried every night behind the desk. Carol Burnett, the guest who brought sunshine. When Carol Burnett sat across from Johnny Carson, the atmosphere of The Tonight Show changed instantly. Carson, often guarded even with his favorite guests, visibly relaxed. His posture loosened, his smile widened, and for a moment, the invisible wall he kept between himself and others seemed to disappear. Carson once told Ed McMahon, "Carol brings sunshine to the stage." Their chemistry felt less like a host interviewing a guest and more like two old friends catching up. That ease was obvious to the audience, who quickly sensed the warmth between them. Unlike most celebrities, Burnett wasn't bound by talking points. Johnny trusted her enough to let conversations wander. She might toss out a spontaneous game, tell a story with no setup, or even flip the interview back on Carson himself. He never worried she'd embarrass him. He knew her instincts for timing matched his own. Off-camera, Burnett's kindness mattered just as much. She greeted crew members by name, asked about their families, and treated everyone like equals. Johnny, who noticed such details, valued her lack of ego. Producers recalled Carson breaking her own rules for her, extending her airtime even if it meant bumping other guests. For Johnny, Carol Burnett wasn't just a favorite. She was proof that comedy could also feel like genuine friendship. James Garner. What a movie star should be. When James Garner appeared on The Tonight Show, the mood shifted from Hollywood glamour to something far more grounded. Carson once remarked to a producer, "He's what a movie star should be, and most aren't." Garner's appeal wasn't built on polish or ego, but on authenticity. Unlike many leading men, Garner didn't tell inflated stories or bask in his own fame. He spoke about films like The Great Escape or Maverick, the way an office worker might describe a long day on the job, funny mishaps, backstage pranks, or the quirks of co-stars. His tales felt relatable rather than rehearsed, and Carson appreciated that refreshing honesty. What impressed Johnny even more was Garner's character off-camera. He arrived without fanfare, thanked the crew, and treated everyone, whether producers or pages, with the same easy respect. Carson paid close attention to those details, and Garner passed every test. Their friendship occasionally peeked through on air. Carson, who rarely mixed his private and professional worlds, would sometimes reference personal conversations or shared experiences. That familiarity was rare, and it showed how much he valued Garner. For Johnny, James Garner embodied the rarest Hollywood trait of all: stardom without pretense. George Burns, the legend who kept getting better. When George Burns appeared on The Tonight Show, Carson treated him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. By then, Burns was not only a comedy legend, but living history, a direct link to vaudeville, the tradition that had shaped Carson's own sense of humor. What amazed Johnny most was that Burns never faded. While many aging stars recycled old routines, Burns somehow grew sharper with age. At 80, 90, even past 100, his timing was flawless, his wit as quick as ever. Carson often told his staff, "George is the only person in Hollywood who gets funnier every year." Carson's respect showed in how he ran their interviews. Normally, he guided conversations carefully, but with Burns, he stepped back, letting him command the segment. Producers noted Johnny sometimes went several minutes without saying a word, simply laughing along and enjoying the master at work. Off camera, Carson valued the private lessons only Burns could give, stories of vaudeville performers and comedy pioneers he'd grown up admiring. During commercial breaks, Johnny leaned in, eager to learn. For Carson, George Burns wasn't just a guest. He was proof that true comedy never aged. It only deepened. Lucille Ball, television royalty. When Lucille Ball visited The Tonight Show, two television giants shared the stage. Carson had reinvented late night, and Lucy had revolutionized the sitcom. To Johnny, she wasn't just another star, she was royalty. Carson rarely deferred to guests, but with Ball, he did. He laughed more freely, gave her the best camera angles, and often let her run long without interruption. "Make sure you get her reactions, not just mine," he once told his directors, a rare instruction from a man who normally demanded the spotlight. Their bond went beyond comedy. Carson admired Ball not only as a performer, but as a business pioneer. As the first woman to head a major television studio, she had broken barriers that impressed Johnny deeply. He reportedly called her the smartest person in television, a compliment he seldom gave anyone. One unforgettable moment came in 1973, when Carson surprised Ball with her earliest screen test. She teared up before covering with a trademark quip, and Johnny simply let the emotion breathe. That trust spoke volumes. For Carson, Lucille Ball embodied everything he valued: unmatched talent, resilience, and the rare ability to turn television into something timeless. Johnny Carson spent 30 years as America's late-night companion. To millions, he was the smooth professional who never lost control, the host who kept the spotlight firmly on his guests. Yet his list of 9 favorites reveals something deeper. Jimmy Stewart showed that even Carson could be moved to tears. Bob Newhart reminded him that comedy could be effortless when shared with a true peer. Burt Reynolds proved that unpredictability, when handled with charm, could create magic on live television. Orson Welles tapped into Carson's hidden intellectual side, while Jack Benny embodied the comedy blueprint Johnny built his career on. Carol Burnett brought out his warmth, James Garner his respect for authenticity, George Burns his reverence for history, and Lucille Ball his admiration for television, pioneers who broke barriers. Together, they represented the qualities Carson valued most: authenticity, humility, wit, intelligence, and the courage to be genuine in an industry built on performance. For Johnny, favorite guests weren't simply the most famous or glamorous. They were the rare few who allowed him to drop the mask, to stop being Johnny Carson and simply be himself. And in those moments, whether it was laughter, mischief, or even tears, Carson revealed to his audience not just what made a great guest, but what made him human.